Rudyard Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to the Friday Roundtable. I'm joined by Sean Speer, my co-founder and editor at large. We're doing this live, Sean, on YouTube. Glorious video. I gotta say, your camera looks good today, buddy. You've really cleaned up well for the show. I'd love to let listeners and viewers in on your sartorial elegance during the rest of the week, but I won't go there because I'm glad you've shown up, spiffy and looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed on this Friday.
Yeah. Well, that's because, Rudyard, it's a big day in the Spear household. Today, for hockey fans, is the NHL trade deadline day, the last chance for teams with aspirations to win the Stanley Cup to load up with new players. And so, well, of course, I'm excited to talk to you about what's been a busy week in policy and politics. I'll have one eye watching the ticker to see if the Toronto Maple Leafs have traded for that third line center they need to finally win the Stanley Cup.
Because I'm, Johnny come lately Leaf fan. They're actually doing well this season. Do I have anything to worry about, Sean? Are the Leafs potentially going to lose somebody today?
No. The Eastern Conference, the conference in which the Leafs participate, is up for grabs, and so I'm hoping, Roger, that they're loading up, that they're pushing all their chips in. This is a good year as any, it seems to me, to finally break the curse and have a parade.
Yeah, wouldn't that be wonderful? Let's make sure it's an American team on the other side that we humiliate. Maybe one from Ron DeSantis, Florida. He doesn't seem to like Canadians visiting there. He's kind of poo-pooing the billions of dollars that we put into his economy. But I digress. We're lots of opportunity to get into Canada-U.S. because that is going to be the first half of the show. But before we go there, Sean, a huge week for fellows. I got to say, I just want to thank all these people that have signed up for a lifetime subscription to the Hub. I think it's a sign, Sean, of, a little bit of national pride that is brewing out there, and people thankfully, supporting Canadian news outlets like the Hub. Look, I have a New York Times subscription, I confess, but let's be honest about who's writing those stories in the New York Times. A bunch of graduates from Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. And maybe it's nice to sometimes, Sean, have some news that's actually written by Canucks.
Yeah, here. It's been an extraordinary couple of weeks, or a couple of months rather. January, we broke records on the site. February, heading in the same direction. And of course, major growth in our YouTube page, and the support that we've had from heroes and fellows over the past 8 weeks or so is really extraordinary. We can't say enough how grateful we are.
Yeah. And yes, viewers, listeners, check out David Frum's interview with Sean this week. It broke all records for us on YouTube, over 500,000 views, something like 60,000 hours of people watching David's really on point, thoughtful analysis of this moment. But let's jump to our fellows to thank them. I'm going to divide the list up in half here, Sean. The honor roll. I'm going to thank Don C., Paul Douglas H., Bert S., Brock G., Steve V., and James C. Thank you all, and I'll hand over the rest of the list, this deluge of fellows, for you to thank.
Yeah, I have the honor of recognizing Drew F., Marcia M., Mark S., Phil D., Kevin B., and Brooke H. from all parts of the country, Roger, British Columbia to Quebec and everywhere in between. And so thank you to everyone for their support.
And my mother-in-law is on this list this week, so I truly have been a good son here. I'm really thrilled. Thank you so much, Marcia. Greatly appreciate it. Well, let's jump in, Sean, to the first half of the show, which again is open to the entire Hub community, and talk tariffs. And I want to bring up this story that landed today, Friday, in the New York Times that purports, based on Canadian government sources, to give a behind-the-curtain look at the conversations between Justin Trudeau and President Trump. A lot to unpack here, but I want to go to one particular part of this reported story that purports to summarize that early February conversation between Trudeau and Trump after the first round of threatened tariffs, where Trump says something that I think is pretty shocking to read if this is indeed true. According to the New York Times, Trump, quote, told Trudeau that he did not believe that the treaty that demarcates the border between the two countries was valid and that he wanted to revise the boundary. He offered no further explanation. Sean, what are we to make of this? I am in a kind of schizophrenic mood, maybe like many of our listeners and viewers, where on one hand, I'm getting data and incoming that suggests that this president has an eye towards Canada in a way that's a lot more than just reworking NAFTA and settling old trade grievances. On the other hand, I feel maybe like you do, Sean, that there's been a lot of hysteria out there, especially this week, and that ultimately cooler heads are going to need to prevail.
Yeah, and I would just add another line of analysis to what you just set out, and it's the extent to which it has to be said. It seems to me it's clear in the minds of Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberal Party more broadly that these sets of issues have been highly advantageous to the Liberal Party, and so I think you have to understand the way in which these issues have played out in Canada over the past several weeks is to understand the backdrop of a pending election. And you contrast that with Mexico, which had an election soon before Trump himself was elected. And I think that's colored the way in which the Mexican government has handled these issues, choosing instead of maximalist rhetoric and a lot of public-facing commentary to do a lot of the heavy lifting in a dispassionate way and in private. And I guess that is my biggest fear here, Rudyard, is I understand that sense of schizophrenia that people have on these issues. Two things, of course, can be right at the same time. Trump's provocations could be offensive and wrong, but on the same token, I think there's an onus on our government and our policymakers to put the country's interests first. But
Sean, can I just
one of the reasons,
just for the sake and with
please,
great appreciation of your contributions here, just to push back a little bit, because I want to go back to this New York Times story, because there's a second part of it that relates a conversation between Dominic LeBlanc and Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and it summarizes conversations between Lutnick and LeBlanc after that February 3rd call. And it's according to the sources, multiple sources to the New York Times, presumably leaks from the Canadian government. Lutnick said to LeBlanc that Trump, quote, had come to realize that the relationship between the United States and Canada was governed by a slew of agreements and treaties that were easy to abandon. According to Lutnick, Trump was interested, quote, in doing just that. He wanted to eject Canada out of the intelligence sharing group known as the Five Eyes. He wanted to tear up the Great Lakes agreements and conventions governing water usage between the two countries. And Trump, was also reviewing military cooperation, particularly the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. So, Sean, again, I want to try to be able to think of two contradictory ideas at the same time. But when I read these words, I start to think to myself that we may be in a situation here that's more serious than we might hope or have thought even a week or so ago. And that this president, yes, is obsessed with tariffs, clearly flip-flopped again on them this week under pressure from industry and possibly the stock market. Who knows? But above and beyond all that, Sean, there is a real animus here towards Canada that goes well beyond economics, that is about sovereignty. It's about national security. And if that is true, Sean, then the political response and the policy response, to me, needs to be notched up a level, because this is a much more serious threat than just an unfortunate and potentially very damaging collapse of the economic bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States.
Yeah, and we'll see how that plays out. But you mentioned a couple of times that the reason that we know these details is because they've been leaked ostensibly by Canadian officials, and that reflects my point that what's made it hard, I think, for a lot of us to try to make sense of what's going on is that we have these provocations from the administration that, as you say, cover a range of different claims and arguments, everything from fentanyl to 51st state and virtually everything in between. But we've also had, I think, in a series of cases that from the Trudeau government, the Liberal Party more generally, a tendency, I think, to accentuate these broader issues because it's self-evident that the party has made major gains in the face of these issues.
Agreed,
and so
Sean.
I guess that's a long.
Sean. I mean, agreed. There's a lot we could say, a lot of partisan political hay being made here, but I'm trying to be open-minded about this. If indeed these are accurate descriptions of the types of conversations that our prime minister and senior cabinet ministers have been having with their American counterparts, then I would argue that some of this rhetoric is not only warranted, it's important that the Canadian public begins to hear this, because this would suggest that we should be, and again, maybe an election won't be the time to do this, but shortly thereafter, we will need to have a pretty tough conversation about what kinds of sacrifices, economic and otherwise, will be required if indeed we are facing a security threat, not simply an economic threat. And I think that is a very important category difference in terms of how you choose to think about this thing and then what your response is to it. And I think this story and what we're hearing now suggests that there maybe is more credence than I initially thought to seeing this through a security paradigm, not an economic paradigm solely.
Maybe.
But you don't want to go there.
Utterances,
you don't want to go there.
Well, maybe the utterances from different voices in around the administration have been so unreliable, and so you're left with your own kind of prudential judgment about how to interpret them, the extent to which they're just popping off, or whether it reflects something deeper. You know, we trust our political leaders to exercise that type of prudential judgment. But I come back to the point. I think the question for people in and around government is, as you say, at what point do you bring these concerns to the Canadian public versus keeping them private in the name of trying to reach some type of settlement or arrangements with the administration? And if you are ultimately going to feel the need to present a broader case to the Canadian public, I'm not sure you do that through leaks to the New York Times or through some of the offhand comments that the Prime Minister has made over the past week or so. I think if ultimately the government's convinced that it is something bigger based on what they've heard both in public and private, then we're going to need like an address from the Prime Minister, Rudyard, to the country, setting out that kind of evidence.
Yeah, I will just say that if this indeed is more than an economic threat, it is in a sense a growing and real security risk, then our political leaders also, and here I mean Mark Carney, who we'll talk about in the second half of the show today, but also Pierre Poilievre, need to similarly get serious. And talking about a middle-class tax cut, along with reaching 2% NATO defense spending, along with massive infrastructure spending, is just not a serious conversation. I don't even think it's serious in the context of the economic threat. But if we are facing an economic threat that is masking a more serious security threat to our sovereignty, then it's time that, we have a much more grown-up conversation about what may be required of government and of us. And I think, to the credit of the Europeans this week, they seem a lot further down the road than we do in terms of having that more serious conversation, and doing what they need to do to secure their security. They've chosen to look at this primarily because of Russia through a security lens. We're not there yet. I hope we don't get there, Sean. But yes. I get a little bit cynical about what I'm hearing from both Mark Carney and, understandably, the bidding war that gets set up with the Conservatives as to, here's your cake and eat it too. We can fight a once in a generation, a once in a century economic war with the United States. And hey, don't worry, we'll send you some more checks in the mail. We'll meet all of our NATO requirements, and we'll build all kinds of fantastic infrastructure across Canada. I feel, Sean, like the Europeans at least are heading towards the kind of hard-headed place that we've got to go, even if this just ends up being an economic threat at the end of the day.
Yeah, well said. So on this point, we're fully aligned. I'll have a long-form essay out in tomorrow's weekend newsletter that unpacks precisely the issues you've just set out. It's worth setting out some context for our audience. The type of spending commitments that Carney and Poilievre are making against the backdrop of a $50 billion deficit, and one that is bound to go up in the face of deteriorating economic circumstances, are pretty difficult to square. If you were to take them at their word, that they wanted to both spend a bunch of money, cut a bunch of taxes, and still balance the budget over the next few years, Rudyard, we would be talking about a set of fiscal changes that would exceed anything we saw in the 1990s and anything we saw in the Harper government in terms of the types of spending cuts you would need in order to make that arithmetic work. So I think you're right on this precise point, that we do need to have a kind of adult conversation about how we're going to make 2 + 2 = 4 in a world in which we've neglected spending on security and defense for long, not just the Trudeau government, but for decades. And if nothing else, we're going to have to boost spending in those areas to meet our commitments, to say nothing of going beyond them, to make sure that we can plausibly defend ourselves in an increasingly fraught world.
Yeah. Well said. Well, look, let's say goodbye to our complimentary listeners and viewers here. We're going to join all those wonderful Hub fellows that have joined our community this week, and all of our Hub heroes on the other side of this short break, to pick up a conversation about the big Liberal leadership contests. Well, maybe not so big, but big for them. And we'll see an election, maybe big for the country, right after this short break.